Hey guys, Scott here. Today I want to go over just sort of like the idea of an ultimate asymmetrical game that combines all of the best aspects and removes all of the worst aspects from all of the ones that we've had before, and just kind of theorize and theorycraft on what the ultimate asymmetrical game would be like. The first thing I want to go over with that whole topic is the genre itself. For some reason, when we hear asymmetrical, what's the word that comes after that? It's always horror. It's always asymmetrical horror. And I'm not sure why that really has to be a thing. I think that we've seen from Dead by Daylight, it's not really that much of a horror game anymore. And it is still maintained its popularity as the strongest asymmetrical game in terms of player base and stuff like that. So I think that tying it down specifically to horror is not really a requirement. And in fact, sometimes it could be a detriment. I use Texas Chainsaw Massacre as sort of an example of it being a detriment because the developers designed and basically balanced that game as if that people would pretend that they are in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The entire game is balanced by the fact that you act like you're in the game and it's an immersive horror experience, which is cool for the first couple of hours of the game. It very much is frightening and it's scary, but as anyone that's played games on the internet for long enough can tell you, games stop being scary past a certain point, especially when they're online. Now, a lot of scary games that have existed, Alien Isolation, like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, these are typically games you play one time, and then that's just pretty much it. You don't really touch them ever again. And because of that, you're not overexposed to anything, and it remains scary the entire time, and your memory of it was, damn, that game was scary. But if you play a game like this, or Texas Chainsaw, or any game that's meant to be an asymmetrical horror, past a certain point, it's just simply not scary anymore. The most you'll do is get jump scared by, like a hag trap or whatever. Just like, just a quick little, but it's not like the environment and the atmosphere is not really horror anymore. Now it's more of a hide and go seek and a tag cat and mouse type game. And that's just typically how these games boil down to. So I think a core component is the game needs to not function only if it's interpreted as a horror game, because that will quickly dwindle and ensures that your game will have a shorter lifespan. Because if that's the only way it functions, if you pretend that you're in a horror environment, well, that facade is going to go away very quickly, and then you're just left with nothing. So it needs to be more than that just being the selling component of the game. So I think focusing on horror is not the correct play. It can be horror themed and stuff like that, sort of like Dead by Daylight. It's horror themed, but it's not a horror game. So I think that's one of the important things there. Now, the actual asymmetrical part, we have to go over what is the correct amount of asymmetrical and what does asymmetrical even mean? So I think some people try to say asymmetrical means that, two different teams have different goals and stuff like that, but I think that's even too lenient. I think asymmetrical, the genre, should just simply be there is an uneven amount of players on each team. That is what asymmetrical means, and I'm sticking with that. Because by the other way's logic, you could just say that every game is asymmetrical, and so Counter-Strike is asymmetrical because the counter-terrorists have to defuse the bomb and the terrorists have to plant the bomb. You never call Counter-Strike an asymmetrical shooter game. That's not really how it works. So I think the disparity in team members is what is important. Now, what's the correct amount? I think Dead by Daylight actually does nail it. I think 1v4 is the correct way to do it. Now, there are pros and cons to having differing amounts. For example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a 3v4, and one of the pros with that is with Killer, you can play with your friends, and that's actually exciting. Being able to coordinate the killer role with other people is cool, but the major downside is it becomes very black and white how chases go, especially in Texas Chainsaw, for example. If you're chasing one person in that game and they're just running you around, you'll essentially never get them. But as soon as you bring two people into the mix, then that person is screwed and they're sandwiched in between two people and they just eat shit. It's sort of like playing against the Knight in Dead by Daylight. Sometimes you just get put in a scenario where the guard goes one way and the player goes another and you just don't have any options and it just doesn't feel good. So it goes from you having no options as killer to you instantly winning as killer with no real in between. And I think there's no good way to mitigate that scenario if there are multiple killers in that type of role on that side. So that's why I think a 1v4 is the correct way to do it. The killer is the one that's making all of the decisions, and the game can be more closely balanced around the experience of just having one active chase at a time, and I think that's the best way to do it. Now, later, I will talk about having custom modes and things like that. I think having, 2v8 modes and other modes that are not ranked but used to break up the monotony of the standard game are fine, and that's great. In fact, that would be amazing. But it shouldn't be the base mode in how the game is currently balanced. So, Dead by Daylight, I point to a lot because undoubtedly it's the most successful asymmetrical game that has existed. So I keep going back to bringing up parts of that, but I'm not going to pretend the game is perfect either. There are a lot of things that a perfect asymmetrical game would do that DBD does not do. One of the major things is how Dead by Daylight does map RNG and map generation. This is something I think the game does poorly. Now, the developers have gone on record for Dead by Daylight saying that they want the game to be able to be won by worse players against better players, and they want better players to be able to lose against worse players. And that's entirely due to the map RNG enabling these underdog scenarios to happen. Now, I understand where they're coming from, because as a new player, it feels good beating a player who is clearly better than you, or a team that's clearly better than you, because the map just went in your favor and you got lucky with that kind of stuff. It does feel good beating people that are better than you. At the same time, it feels horrible losing to people you know are worse than you because the game has decided to screw you. So I understand where they're coming from with that. They like the underdog scenario, but I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good philosophy to have. So what I think you should do is still have map RNG. You want there to be not stagnation in the maps. So what I would do is have, however many maps, but have handcrafted, specifically designed variants to each map. So you would have, like a coal tower map, but there would be 5 variations of that map, and those variations, they're the same every single time. So it'd be like loading on Dust 1 or Dust 2 or something like that. You would know what map you're on, but you still have to learn all of the maps and learn where everything is. And it's still too much knowledge to remember where everything is and every palette and every corner and everything. It's still too much to learn, but it ensures that we're not going to have these scenarios where better players are getting destroyed by worse players because the game has just decided, hey, this map is impossible for you to win, get fucked. That's just a bad design in my opinion. So I think handcrafted maps, but having a lot of variants in each one of the maps is the best way to do it. That way, it's still different every time, but you're able to, make it so that the maps are not insanely broken and favored one side or the other. I think that's the best way to do it there. Additionally, we have to go over objectives. So I think most people will agree that Survivor in Dead by Daylight is something that they don't do very well. The Survivor gameplay, when you're getting chased, it's fun, it's awesome, but then everything else other than that is very unexciting, whereas a game like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Survivor gameplay is actually, there's a lot more going on. You're always doing something. You're never just really sitting there unless you're, opening the gas valve or something. I mean, even then, you're not just sitting there for 90 seconds doing it. So there are a lot more differentiations in gameplay in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I think you need to have that in the ultimate asymmetrical game. At the same time, that becomes incredibly hard to balance, because in a game like Texas Chainsaw, you can have the survivors winning the match in 2 minutes, and that feels like shit too. So you need to have Dead by Daylight's guaranteed minimum amount of time for the game to end, but you also need Texas Chainsaw's freedom to roam about the map while still accomplishing objectives and not having to sit in one place at the same time. And this brings up a suggestion a lot of people have said over the years for Dead by Daylight, which would be to have generators or computers or whatever the gimmick is that you have to complete, but they require parts to enable. And because they require parts to enable, they take half the time to do. So you'd have gens that would finish in 40 seconds, something like that. But in order to work on that generator, you would need to find the part that goes to that generator. So you would touch the generator and it would highlight it on the map. Typically, it's going to be a significant distance away from you, because that incentivizes all the most fun parts about the game. It incentivizes hiding from the killer. It incentivizes the actual chases between killer, interactions between killer. The killer's not just sitting there, in a 3-gen, making everyone bored and just trying to drag that out. So I think that's the best way to do it. Having a minimum time so the games can't end in 2 or 3 minutes, but also making it so the gameplay is a lot more varied and exciting. You're finding different parts for these things while still having to do is sit there for a little bit of time to ensure that the game doesn't end too fast, but you're still having a lot more movement around the map, a lot more opportunities to hide from the killer, a lot more exciting scenarios to happen. I think that would really fix a lot of the issues while still maintaining the balance that is kind of necessary for that type of game. The next thing is there has to be some type of skill ceiling in the game that's not immediately achievable. At the same time, there needs to be a skill floor that's accessible so new players get into the game. A game like VHS, for example, had a pretty high skill ceiling, but the skill floor was also a little too high, and so new players just had a miserable experience with that. A game like Dead by Daylight actually has a surprisingly low skill floor and a surprisingly high skill ceiling. The skill floor If you're new to killer and you're going against new survivors, you pick Wraith, you go, okay, I right-click this thing, I'm not invisible anymore, I hit people, and then they die. It's not really too much to it. As survivor, you go, oh, I run to these blocks of wood, and I press spacebar, and it stuns them where they can't hit me. It's really not that crazy to get into. Now, the one thing that's a bit harder is when you start having a game with such a huge roster, you have to start learning how killers work, and some killers are far more complicated than others. Now, in new player lobbies, you're not as likely to have paid DLC killers that are a lot more complicated. You're more likely to have, just like your Wraith and Billy and Trapper and just your basic killers that are very easy to understand. And the game sort of simplifies that problem by having, newer MMR players go against newer MMR players where they're less likely to invest money into the game and purchase DLC and stuff. So that problem sort of fixes itself. But it's a very hard task making a low skill floor but a high skill ceiling. And that is something you have to theorize and theorycraft a lot more than just, a 15-minute video here. That is extremely hard to do. You need the killer powers to be hard to master, but also easy to understand what's happening. Huntress is a really good example of a low skill floor, but a high skill ceiling. You understand as Huntress and going against Huntress what she does. She throws a hatchet. That's it. It's a very simple power. But the trajectory, what you can throw over, where the hitboxes actually are, all of this stuff is stuff that takes a very long time to actually master on both killer and survivor, knowing where you're going to get hit and knowing where you can hit. So that's a really good example of the powers that need to be designed for that type of game. And on the survivor side, I think the loop gameplay is actually pretty good. I think DBD does the survivor actual chase exciting parts a lot better than most other asymmetrical games. And no, a lot of salty killers and people with not a lot of hours in the game are, there's no skill to survivor. You just run the pallet and then press space and hold W. Yeah, if you're on the game or something, sure, that argument applies because that map is stupid. But for the most part, if you think DBD survivor is just as simple as running the pallets, dropping them, running the pallets, dropping them, that's it, there's nothing else to it, then I'm sorry to say, you're probably not very good at survivor and you're the teammate that nobody wants on their team because you're just wasting everything and then they just die later. So there's a lot of nuance to survivor gameplay. It's why all good killers can immediately tell the difference within 20 seconds of chasing if they're a mediocre survivor, a bad survivor, a good survivor, or an oh shit, I can't chase the survivor. You would not have these arguments that people make where they say they only go against the top tier players, but then at the same time say that this game requires no skill. You can't have both of those sentences happening. So DBD is an example of a game that does actually have a skill ceiling, but it's not super high. I think DBD has like the perfect type of skill ceiling. It's not like a fighting game or an RTS where it can take, hundreds, thousands of hours to really begin to master. It's a game that you can learn and pick up pretty quick and get to a decent level pretty fast, but there's always room to learn a little tiny bit more. I think that's the perfect level of accessibility to where you can identify the good from the great, but also it doesn't take your entire life mastering the game to get into. And that's why I do think DBD has like that perfect balance of, there's very easy stuff like Wraith and there's very hard stuff like, Blight and Wesker and stuff like that. So there are definitely nuances to it there, but I do think the survivor gameplay in DBD is the core loop that I would like to see replicated. Incidentally, another game, Deathgarden, that didn't live too long, kind of had that example where it wasn't even a horror game and the survivors were still just trying to survive, but they had a lot more interesting ideas. You had kind of these parkour elements that allowed you to do more things that had higher skill cap. And I would not mind seeing something like that actually happen in the ultimate asymmetrical game. Some type of parkour skill or even jumping or just some type of cooler, interesting movement than running around and dropping wood on people. I think you could do that well and still have it be very exciting while also making it still balanced. So I think that would be the best way to do it. Again, not super clear how you would do it, but that's the right path to go on, in my opinion. Finally, I think a very important thing for the game's longevity is there needs to be something to grind to. DBD does as well with 8 trillion cosmetics. You can earn shards to even buy killers, new perks and stuff like that. That's a good example of how to do it. There's always something to grind for. And also, I think there needs to be custom games. There needs to be like Counter-Strike like a server browser. And by all means, it would not be the main game. It would not be a ranked thing. You wouldn't earn any points, whatever the equivalent would that be. It would just be a separate thing that you can do once you're fed up with your current day of the main game and just go play on a hide and go seek map or a surf map or a prop hunt map or just something that the modding community will undoubtedly make within 5 minutes because they're insane. and then you have something that lets you keep playing the game rather than just stay frustrated with it. So that is something that a lot of ASIMs suffer with. People get burnout on the game that they're playing, but there's not really other alternatives to go play. So you're just stuck going, oh, I guess I'll just angrily continue to queue into the game I'm mad at. If there was a built-in side mode that modders could mess with to give you a reprieve from the monotony of the original game, the main game, that would make people they would make people launch the game and put more players into the game for such a longer amount of time. It would make the game last like forever. And I think that is something that you would need to build into a new game by default. Adding custom modes to a game that's already established is a little muddy, but building a game with that in mind, I think, is the correct way to do it. So overall, that's what I think I would do. It would be an asymmetrical game. It would be 1v4, not necessarily horror-based. Survivors would have some more type of advanced movements, maybe even some type of low-level power, kind of like how Texas Chainsaw Massacre does it. They would also have to still do some type of guaranteed generator, but it would take much less time, and they would have to spend an equal amount of time finding the part to it to incentivize more gameplay between killer and survivor, and less time sitting and being bored doing something like that. The core looping gameplay I find to be completely acceptable. Again, with different movement, making it a bit more exciting, that would be fine. There would have to be some type of custom modes that would be enabled by a server browser and things like that. There would be something to grind to, and there needs to be a fairly high skill ceiling, but not intimidatingly stupid high, while also maintaining a low skill floor that makes new players not scared to get into it. And finally, an actually accurate matchmaking system in some way that makes it so you're not going against 10-hour people when you have 10,000 hours and vice versa. That to me would be the ultimate asymmetrical game, and I would love to see that. Someone do that, please.